Enzo Vitale, devastatingly handsome and dangerous, held Ana Morales' hand at a glittering charity gala, the diamonds on her wrist feeling as heavy as handcuffs. His voice was a possessive rumble in her ear, a secret vibration meant only for her. "You see, my dear Ana," he murmured, his thumb stroking the delicate skin on the back of her hand, a gesture that was both a caress and a claim. "You belong to me now. This is your world." Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird caught between the bars of sheer terror and a dark, forbidden thrill she dared not name. The camera of her memory froze on her wide, conflicted eyes, a reflection of 1,000 glittering lights and one all-consuming darkness. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The organized chaos of JFK International Airport was a symphony of human weariness. The air, thick with the competing scents of industrial floor cleaner and stale coffee, hung heavy under the relentless hum of fluorescent lights. They cast a sterile, unflattering glow on the river of travelers flowing around the baggage carousel, their faces etched with the fatigue of long journeys and the anxiety of arrival. Among them was Ana Morales, a librarian in her mid-20s, feeling every mile of the 2-week solo trip to Spain she was returning from. The journey had been a quiet prescription to mend a quietly broken heart, a pilgrimage to rediscover a sense of self she felt had eroded over time. Now, all she craved was the sanctuary of her own apartment, the familiar scent of old paper and lavender, the comforting weight of a book in her hands. Dressed for comfort in soft, worn jeans and a simple gray sweater that had seen better days, her dark hair pulled into a messy bun that had long since surrendered to gravity, she looked as exhausted as she felt. Her shoulders slumped, not just from the weight of her carry-on, but from the bone-deep weariness that only transatlantic travel can induce. Her own suitcase, a standard, unremarkable black roller bag, was one of a dozen identical models that paraded before her on the monotonous loop of the carousel. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a familiar, insistent vibration. It was her mother. Ana pressed the phone to her ear, her voice a little rough. "Hi, Mom. Yes. I landed safely." Her mother's anxious voice, a torrent of questions about the flight, the turbulence, and whether she'd eaten, was a familiar comfort, but it pulled her focus. Her eyes, tired and slightly unfocused, scanned the parade of luggage. She offered vague reassurances to her mother, her mind already halfway home, picturing a hot shower and the embrace of her own bed. "Yes, Mom, I'm fine. Just waiting for my bag. I'll call you when I get home." Then she saw it. A black suitcase, identical to hers, emerged from the rubber-flapped maw of the conveyor belt. With a sigh of relief that was more of a weary exhalation, she ended the call and stepped forward. She pulled it from the belt, the muscles in her arm protesting the sudden weight. It felt heavier than she remembered, a dense, unyielding block. She attributed the strain to jet lag, to the accumulated fatigue that made every physical effort feel monumental. She was just tired, she told herself, so very tired. With her prize in tow, she joined the throng of people heading for the exit, oblivious to the fact that her simple, unremarkable life was about to become anything but. Anna's one-bedroom apartment in Queens was her sanctuary, a cozy, book-filled haven that stood in stark contrast to the impersonal chaos of the city outside. Overflowing bookshelves lined the walls, their spines a colorful mosaic of stories waiting to be revisited. A half-finished jigsaw puzzle of a Van Gogh painting covered her coffee table, and the air was filled with the gentle, calming scent of lavender and old paper. It was a space that was wholly and completely hers. She wrestled the heavy suitcase through the door, the effort leaving her breathless. She dropped her keys on the small entryway table and knelt before the bag, eager to unpack her Spanish souvenirs and laundry. She inserted her small key into the lock, but it wouldn't turn. It snagged, refusing to go in more than a fraction of an inch. Annoyance, a small, sharp prickle, rose through her exhaustion. She tried again, jiggling the key, her frustration mounting. It was her suitcase, her lock, her key. Why wouldn't it work? With a groan, she rummaged through her purse and pulled out a sturdy metal nail file. If the lock wouldn't cooperate, the zipper would have to be forced. She wedged the tip of the file into the zipper mechanism and pried. For a moment, it resisted. And then, with a sickening pop, the zipper gave way. The suitcase sprang open. For a long, silent moment, Anna simply stared, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. This was not her suitcase. Instead of her neatly folded clothes, her worn paperbacks, and the small painted tiles she'd bought in Seville, she was confronted with a sight so alien, so utterly terrifying. It seemed to suck the very air from her lungs. Bundles of $100 bills were stacked in perfect, crisp rows, filling one entire side of the case. On the other side, nestled in custom-fit black foam, lay several sleek black handguns, their metallic surfaces gleaming under the warm light of her living room lamp. Tucked into a side pocket was a small collection of passports, maybe 5 or 6 of them. She picked one up with a trembling hand. A different name, a different nationality, but the photograph was the same on each. A dangerously handsome man with piercing dark eyes, a face carved from sharp angles and severe beauty, his expression a mask of cold, unreadable confidence. A wave of ice-cold terror washed over her, so potent it made her physically recoil. She scrambled backward, away from the open case, her heart beginning to pound a frantic, deafening rhythm in her ears. The smell, a bizarre combination of gun oil and the crisp, clean scent of new currency, was a violation in her gentle, book-scented apartment. It was the smell of a world she knew nothing about, a world of violence and danger. Her mind raced, a panicked litany of worst-case scenarios flashing through her thoughts. Call the police? The words formed in her head but died before they could become a plan. How could she possibly explain this? A librarian from Queens with a suitcase full of guns and what looked like millions of dollars. They would think she was a criminal, a terrorist, a mad woman. Her immediate, desperate plan was the only one that seemed survivable. Get the suitcase closed, get it back to the airport, and pretend this horrifying discovery had never, ever happened. She lunged forward, her hands shaking violently as she tried to force the two halves of the suitcase back together. The contents had shifted, and the zipper, now broken, refused to catch. Panic, raw and acidic, clawed at her throat. As she frantically wrestled with the case, a loud, authoritative knock echoed from her front door. It wasn't the polite tap of a neighbor or a delivery person. It was a summons, a hard, impatient sound that vibrated through the wood and straight into her bones. She froze, her blood turning to ice. Who could possibly be at her door? Before she could even think to move, to hide, to breathe, she heard a distinct, sharp series of clicks from the lock. It was a sound she'd only ever heard in movies. The sound of a lock being expertly, effortlessly picked. The doorknob turned, and the door swung inward. He filled the doorway, a silhouette against the dim light of the hallway, and her world tilted on its axis. It was him, the man from the passports. In person, his presence was overwhelming, a physical force that seemed to consume all the air in the room. He was tall, broader than he appeared in the photos, and impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored suit that accentuated his powerful frame. His face was all sharp angles and severe beauty, but it was his eyes, dark and intensely focused, that commanded all attention. They radiated an aura of absolute power and a lethal, unnerving calm. Behind him, 2 other men, equally large and imposing in their own dark suits, stood as silent and still as statues. The man's gaze swept the room, taking in the bookish clutter, the half-finished puzzle, and finally landing on the open suitcase on the floor. Then his eyes lifted and met hers. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, smooth baritone, utterly calm, but laced with a thread of steel that sent a fresh wave of terror through her. "I believe you have something of mine." Anna's own voice was a strangled whisper, barely audible. It was a mistake, an accident. I was going to bring it back." Her words sounded feeble, pathetic even to her own ears. His gaze flickered from her terrified face back to the open suitcase. A silent confirmation, an unreadable emotion, something that might have been surprise or perhaps even faint amusement, flickered in the depths of his dark eyes. With a subtle, almost imperceptible nod of his head, he dismissed his men. They pulled the door shut, the click of the latch echoing in the sudden suffocating silence, and Anna was utterly, terrifyingly alone with the most dangerous man she had ever seen. He had come expecting a rival, a thief, a professional foolish enough to cross him. He had found a librarian. This quiet, trembling woman, surrounded by books and the scent of a life lived in gentle solitude, was a stark, intriguing anomaly in his world. And Anna, paralyzed by a terror so profound, it felt as if her heart had stopped beating altogether, could do nothing but stare into the eyes of the man who now held her life in his hands. Enzo did not threaten her, not with a weapon or a raised voice. The threat was his presence, a suffocating pressure that made her small apartment feel like a shoebox. He moved with a fluid, predatory grace, a panther exploring a new and curious territory. He walked slowly through her living room, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on her worn wooden floors. His dark eyes missed nothing, cataloging the life of the woman whose world he had just shattered. He paused before a bookshelf, his long, elegant fingers brushing over the worn spine of a copy of Pride and Prejudice. He tilted his head, a flicker of something unreadable in his expression. He then moved to the small mantelpiece above her non-functional fireplace, where a collection of mismatched frames held snapshots of her life. He picked up a framed photograph of a smiling younger Anna standing between her parents, their arms wrapped around her. He studied their ordinary, happy faces, his own a mask of cold neutrality. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, until Anna thought she would scream. Finally, he turned back to her, the photograph still in his hand. His voice, when he spoke, was still that low, smooth baritone, but now it held a note of dry, almost academic curiosity. "A librarian," he said, the words hanging in the air. "How quaint. You don't seem the type to be interested in my business affairs." The sheer audacity of his calm demeanor, the way he violated her space and her memories with his casual inspection, ignited a tiny spark of indignation deep within her terror. She found a sliver of courage, a desperate, defiant breath. "I'm not," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I told you it was an accident, a stupid mistake. I just want to give it back and forget this ever happened." She gestured vaguely toward the horrifying suitcase, wishing she could will it, and him, out of existence. Enzo placed the photograph carefully back on the mantel, his movements precise and deliberate. He turned to face her fully, his dark eyes locking onto hers, and the air crackled with a sudden intensity. "Forget," he repeated, the word a soft, dangerous hiss. A humorless smile touched his lips, a brief, cold curving of his mouth that held no warmth at all. "Some things, once seen, cannot be unseen, my dear librarian. You have seen my face, a face connected to several different names. You have seen the contents of this case. In my world," he took a step closer, and she instinctively took a step back, her shoulders hitting the wall. "That makes you a liability." He had not come here just for the suitcase. He was here to manage a security breach, and she, Ana Morales, a woman who alphabetized books for a living, was the breach. His intrigue was palpable. He had expected a professional, a rival foolish enough to make a move, or a common thief who would already be trying to sell the contents. He had not, in any calculation, expected this. This quiet, bookish woman whose transparent honesty and genuine fear were both a profound danger to his operations and a strange, disarming novelty. He was a man who lived and breathed lies, who navigated a world built on deception and betrayal. Her sincerity was a puzzle, a foreign language he suddenly found himself wanting to understand. And as Anna stood pinned by his gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs, she felt her fear begin to mingle with a hot, helpless spark of anger at the complete and utter violation of her home, her safety, and her very life. Enzo's gaze dropped to the open suitcase that lay between them, a chasm of money and metal that represented the impossible gulf between their two worlds. With a soft, definitive click, he reached down and closed it, the sound echoing in the silent apartment like a gavel striking down, sealing her fate. The finality of the gesture sent a fresh wave of dread through her. He straightened up and looked at her, his gaze direct and unwavering, devoid of any emotion she could name. He spoke to her as if discussing a simple business problem, his tone matter-of-fact and chillingly reasonable. "The simplest solution," he began, his voice a low conversational murmur, "would be to eliminate you. My men would expect it. It is the clean, logical course of action to protect my interests." Anna's breath hitched in her throat. The words were so calmly delivered, so devoid of malice, that they were more terrifying than any shouted threat. He was talking about her death as if it were a line item on a balance sheet. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in, watching her face pale, her eyes widen in sheer horror. Then he continued, a subtle shift in his tone. "But I find myself in a lenient mood." He tilted his head slightly, a predator contemplating its prey. "You have incurred a debt, Anna, a significant one." Relief, weak and fleeting, tried to flutter in her chest, but it was immediately crushed by confusion. "I don't have any money," she whispered, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I'm a librarian. I have student loans. I can't pay you." A small, dry laugh escaped him. "I am not interested in your money," he said, dismissing her life savings with a wave of his hand. "The contents of that case, the money, the weapons, they are all replaceable. The breach of my security, however, your knowledge, that requires a different kind of payment. The debt you owe is not financial." He took another step toward her, closing the remaining distance between them. He was so close now, she could smell the faint, expensive scent of his cologne, a clean, sharp fragrance layered over the faint, metallic scent of the guns. "You will repay me with your presence," he stated, his voice dropping to a possessive whisper that slid over her skin like ice. "You will stay with me, at my side. You will be a permanent guest in my home." The words didn't register at first. They were too insane, too far beyond the realm of anything she could comprehend. "What?" she breathed, her mind reeling. "What are you talking about?" The horror of his proposition finally crashed down on her, a tidal wave of disbelief and terror. "That's insane. You're kidnapping me." For the first time, a genuine, albeit humorless, smile touched his lips. "It is a choice," he said softly, though his eyes were hard as diamonds. "You can refuse. My men are very efficient, but I assure you the alternative is far less pleasant and infinitely more permanent." He let that hang in the air, the unspoken threat more potent than any weapon. "So," he concluded, his voice once again calm and businesslike, "you will pack a bag with whatever you deem essential, and you will come with me now, or my men will carry you out in one. The choice," he repeated, the word a mockery, "is yours." The world shrank, the walls of her cozy apartment closing in until the only things that existed were the two of them and the impossible, horrifying choice he had laid at her feet. It was not a negotiation, it was a life sentence, delivered by a man who held all the power. He watched her, his dark eyes intense, a strange predatory curiosity visible within them. He wanted to see what she would do. He wanted to see how this innocent creature, this librarian from Queens, would react when faced with the brutal reality of the world he was about to drag her into. Numbness was a cold, heavy blanket, smothering the panic that threatened to consume her. Shock and terror had short-circuited her ability to think, to feel, to do anything but obey the quiet, steel-laced command of the man who now owned her future. Her hands trembled so badly she could barely grasp the zipper of the small duffel bag she pulled from her closet. What does one pack for a kidnapping? What are the essentials for a life sentence? The question was so absurdly mundane it bordered on hysteria. She grabbed a few changes of clothes, the soft, worn fabrics a comforting, familiar weight in her shaking hands. A pair of jeans, a few sweaters, the simple, unassuming garments of a life that was already gone. She added her toothbrush, her hairbrush, a few toiletries, the small, mundane rituals of a normal day that now seemed like artifacts from a distant past. Enzo watched her every move, his presence a constant, oppressive pressure at her back. He stood near the doorway, silent and still, his arms crossed over his powerful chest. He didn't rush her, affording her this one small, final dignity, the act of packing for her own abduction. It was a courtesy so perverse it made her stomach churn. When she finally zipped the duffel bag, the sound was unnaturally loud in the quiet room. She slung it over her shoulder, the weight of it a pathetic symbol of the life she was being forced to leave behind. As she walked out of her bedroom, her eyes fell on the half-finished jigsaw puzzle on her coffee table. The vibrant colors of Van Gogh's sunflowers, a painful reminder of the simple, quiet joys that had defined her existence. She would never finish it now. When Enzo opened her front door, his 2 men were waiting in the hallway, their faces as impassive and unreadable as stone. One of them stepped forward and took the black suitcase from Enzo without a word. As they walked down the hallway toward the elevators, a door down the hall creaked open. Her neighbor, Mrs. Gable, a sweet elderly woman who always asked about her day, peeked out, her face etched with curiosity. Her eyes widened in fear as she took in the scene, Anna's pale, terrified face, the 3 imposing men in dark suits surrounding her. The curiosity vanished, replaced by a raw, animal fear. The door clicked shut, the deadbolt audibly sliding into place. In that moment, Anna had never felt more alone. The transition from the warm, personal space of her apartment building to the cold, sterile luxury of Enzo's black sedan was jarring and deeply symbolic. The rich, intoxicating scent of genuine leather replaced the familiar, comforting smell of old books and lavender. It was the scent of wealth, of power, of a world she did not belong in. She slid onto the plush seat, the door closing beside her with a soft, heavy thud that sealed her inside. Enzo got in the other side, his presence immediately shrinking the spacious interior. The tinted windows were so dark that the familiar streets of her neighborhood, the corner bodega, the laundromat, the park where she sometimes read on sunny afternoons, were transformed into a distant, alien landscape. It was like watching a movie of her own life, a life she could see but no longer touch. The car pulled away from the curb with a smooth, silent surge of power. Anna stared out the window, her internal monologue a torrent of grief and overwhelming terror. Every street sign, every familiar building was a fresh stab of pain, a reminder of the simple, safe life she had lost. She was a prisoner, and the city she loved, the city that had been her home, was now just the glittering, indifferent backdrop of her cage. The penthouse was not a home. It was a monument to power, a declaration of dominance carved into the sky. It was a masterpiece of cold, modern luxury that occupied the entire top floor of a sleek black skyscraper in the heart of Manhattan. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire space, displaying a breathtaking, almost unreal panoramic view of the city. The skyline glittered, a sprawling galaxy of light and ambition. But from this height, it was silent, a beautiful but distant spectacle. The furniture was minimalist and brutally expensive. all sharp lines and unforgiving angles in a sterile landscape of black, white, and gray. The art on the walls was abstract and imposing, splashes of color that seemed more like controlled violence than creative expression. There were no photographs, no clutter, no sign that a life was actually lived here. It was less a home and more a gallery, and Anna was its newest, most unwilling exhibit. Enzo gave her what he called a tour, but it felt more like an orientation for a new piece of property. His steps were silent on the polished marble floors, his voice a low, even tone that was absorbed by the vast, empty spaces. He showed her to her room, a space so large it could have swallowed her entire queen's apartment with room to spare. It had its own wall of windows looking east over the river, a king-sized bed that looked as hard and uninviting as a block of stone, and an adjoining bathroom that resembled a high-end spa, all chrome and black slate. He opened a door to reveal a walk-in closet, and Anna's breath caught in her throat. It was already filled. Racks of designer clothes, dresses, pants, and blouses in luxurious fabrics she had only ever seen in magazines, hung in perfect, color-coordinated order. Shelves were lined with shoes, from delicate heels to casual flats, and a collection of expensive handbags sat on a display island in the center. Everything was in her size. The discovery was not a kindness, it was a violation, a chilling testament to the speed and efficiency with which he had investigated and now controlled every aspect of her life. He stood in the doorway of the closet, watching her face, his own expression unreadable. "You will have everything you need here," he said, his voice flat and businesslike. "Food, clothes, entertainment. A housekeeper comes in the mornings. You will want for nothing material." He paused, his dark eyes meeting hers. "Your phone will not work outside of this building's private network. You will not leave this apartment without my express permission and without an escort. These are the rules." The words, delivered so calmly, were bars of a cage being slammed shut. A hot, defiant anger surged through her, momentarily eclipsing her fear. "This is a prison," she said, her voice tight and trembling with the force of her outrage. Enzo turned from her and walked to the massive window in the bedroom, looking down at the glittering city below, a king surveying his domain. "It is a gilded cage," he replied, his voice a soft, almost dismissive murmur. "Many would kill for it. You should try to be grateful." He left her then, pulling the heavy door closed behind him, leaving Anna standing in the middle of a luxurious prison cell that was more opulent than any place she had ever been, and more terrifying than any place she could have ever imagined. The luxury was suffocating. Every expensive object, every silk dress and leather shoe was a reminder of her new status as a possession. The stunning panoramic view of the city she loved felt like a taunt, a vibrant living world she could see but no longer touch. She was a bird in a cage, and the cage was beautiful, but it was a cage all the same. The first days of her captivity passed in a blur of silent, suffocating tension. Anna existed like a ghost in the vast, sterile apartment, a whisper of a former life haunting the cold, modern spaces. She stubbornly refused to wear the designer clothes that filled her closet, a small, pathetic act of defiance that felt like the only piece of herself she had left to control. She lived in the few familiar items she had packed in her duffel bag, the soft, worn fabric of her own sweater, a comforting anchor in this alien world. She spent hours exploring her prison, her bare feet padding silently across the cold marble floors. She tested the windows, running her hands along the seamless panes of glass, confirming what she already knew. They were sealed, immovable. She looked for security cameras, her eyes scanning the high ceilings and sharp corners, but the surveillance was too sophisticated, seamlessly integrated into the design. The apartment was a high-tech fortress, beautiful and impenetrable. There was no escape. Enzo was often gone, disappearing for hours or sometimes entire days, conducting the shadowy business that funded this extravagant prison. When he was home, they existed in a state of charged, oppressive silence. They sometimes shared meals, if they could be called that, sitting at opposite ends of a ridiculously long, formal dining table, made of a single polished slab of black granite. The distance between them was a physical manifestation of the chasm that separated their worlds. They ate without exchanging a word. The only sounds the faint clink of silverware on porcelain. Anna's initial, all-consuming terror began to slowly, almost imperceptibly, evolve. It didn't disappear. It was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of her thoughts. But it was joined by a quiet, stubborn resilience. She was not broken. She would not let this man, this life, break her. One afternoon, while exploring the apartment, she discovered a door she hadn't noticed before, tucked away in a corner of the main living area. It opened into a small, untouched library. The air inside was different, still and quiet, with the faint, familiar scent of aging paper and leather. Unlike the rest of the penthouse, this room felt warm, human. Books filled the shelves from floor to ceiling, their spines a rich tapestry of color and texture. She began to read, the familiar act of escaping into stories providing a small, precious anchor to her old self, to the librarian she used to be. Enzo observed her quiet defiance with a growing, unsettling intrigue. He was a man accustomed to hysterics from the women in his life, or worse, a fawning, cloying submission. They were trophies, ornaments, their reactions predictable and easily managed. Anna was different. Her silent, watchful resistance was new. She didn't cry or plead or scream. She simply endured, her chin held high, her eyes holding a spark of unbroken spirit that he found both irritating and fascinating. He found himself wanting to provoke a reaction, to hear her voice, to break through the wall of impenetrable silence she had built around herself. One evening, he came home to find her curled in a large armchair in the library, lost in a thick leather-bound volume. The next day, he began a silent, one-sided conversation. He started leaving specific books on a side table in the main living area, titles he thought she might appreciate. A rare first edition of a classic she had mentioned loving in a passing comment he had overheard. A collection of poetry by a relatively unknown author he admired. It was a subtle gesture, a test, a way of reaching for her without speaking, and he waited, with an uncharacteristic patience, to see if she would reach back. A violent thunderstorm crashed over the city, a dramatic, primal display of nature's fury that seemed to mirror the turmoil in Anna's own soul. Flashes of lightning illuminated the penthouse in stark, dramatic bursts, followed by deep, rolling peals of thunder that vibrated through the floor. Anna, unable to sleep, was curled on a sofa, watching the storm, when a sound from the other side of the apartment startled her. It was the sharp, distinct sound of breaking glass. Her heart leaped into her throat. Was it an intruder? Was the fortress not so impenetrable after all? Cautiously, her body tense with fear, she followed the noise to Enzo's study. The door was ajar, a sliver of dim light spilling into the darkened hallway. She peered inside and found him standing by a small bar, pouring a glass of amber liquid, his hand so unsteady that the neck of the decanter rattled against the rim of the glass. There was a fresh, bleeding cut on his cheekbone, a thin line of crimson against his pale skin, and his knuckles were raw and bruised. The skin split over the bones. For the very first time since she had met him, the mask of icy, absolute control had slipped, revealing a man who looked weary, burdened, and dangerously frayed at the edges. The question escaped her lips before she could stop it, a soft, involuntary sound in the quiet room. "Are you all right?" The words seemed to surprise them both. Enzo stiffened, his back going rigid. He didn't turn around, but she saw his shoulders tense. Then a short, humorless laugh, devoid of any mirth, broke the silence. "A business disagreement," he said, his voice rough. Anna took a hesitant step into the room. "You mean you hurt someone," she stated. The words not a question, but a sad, simple fact. Now he turned, his dark eyes finding hers in the dim light. His face hardened, the brief flicker of vulnerability vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. "I did what was necessary," he said, his voice cold as steel. "In my world, Anna, weakness is a death sentence. You show it for a second, and you lose everything." He tossed back the whiskey in one swallow, the movement sharp and aggressive. Anna watched him, and in that moment, a strange, compassionate impulse overrode her fear. This man was a monster, a kidnapper, the architect of her misery, but he was also a wounded animal, bleeding in his own luxurious cage. Without a word, she turned and went to the spa-like bathroom in her own suite, her mind working on autopilot. She found a first aid kit under the sink, its contents neat and sterile. She returned to the study, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. Enzo was still standing by the bar, watching her, his expression a mixture of suspicion and confusion. She walked directly to him, her resolve a fragile shield against her terror. After a moment's hesitation, she opened the kit and took out an antiseptic wipe. Wordlessly, she reached up and gently began to clean the cut on his face. Enzo froze at her touch, his entire body going rigid, as if he had been struck by lightning. The simple, gentle gesture was so foreign to him, so completely devoid of the fear or transactional intent that colored every other human interaction in his life, that he literally did not know how to react. Her fingers were soft against his skin, her touch feather-light, her focus entirely on the small clinical task. It was a profound shock to his system, a moment of unconditional human kindness in a life built on violence and control. For Anna, it was a flicker of her innate self, the librarian, the caregiver, an act of humanity that somehow transcended the terror and the impossible situation she was in. She was cleaning a wound, that was all, but for Enzo, it was everything. In that moment, as she gently dabbed at his skin, her brow furrowed in concentration, he saw her not as his prisoner, not as a liability or a complication, but simply as a woman, a kind and gentle woman, and it stirred something deep inside him, a deeply buried, fiercely protective instinct that was entirely different from the cold, possessive desire for ownership he had felt before. It was a crack in his armor, a small, intimate moment that would change everything. The moment of shared, fragile humanity in the study had changed something fundamental between them. An invisible line had been crossed. A few days later, Enzo announced they were going out. It was not a request. He informed her that it was time she was introduced to his world, a strategic move, he explained with chilling detachment, to declare her as his, and quell any inconvenient rumors that might be circulating. He had a dress laid out for her on the bed, a sheath of deep emerald silk that shimmered under the light. It was beautiful, elegant, and felt entirely alien. Putting it on, Anna felt as though she were donning a costume, preparing for a role in a play she didn't understand, with stakes that were terrifyingly real. The destination was a lavish, exclusive Italian restaurant in a discreet corner of Manhattan, a place called Il Silenzio. The name, The Silence, was apt. It was known as a neutral ground for the city's elite criminal underworld, a place where deals were made and tensions were managed over plates of exquisite food and glasses of obscenely expensive wine. The moment they walked in, the entire room seemed to shift, to hold its breath. The low hum of conversation faltered. Powerful men in tailored suits, men with cold eyes and the predatory stillness of sharks, paused their discussions to watch Enzo's entrance. Beautiful women, draped in jewels and designer gowns, turned their heads, their expressions a mixture of deference and fear. It was a display of raw, silent power that made the hairs on Anna's arms stand on end. Enzo was utterly unfazed, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back, guiding her through the maze of tables as if he owned the very air they all breathed. He introduced her to no one, simply nodding curtly at a few individuals. He introduced her simply as Anna, her lack of a last name or any further explanation making her status both mysterious and absolute. She was with him, and in this world, that was all that mattered. They were seated at a secluded corner table that offered a commanding view of the entire room. Before they could even look at their menus, a man approached their table. He was handsome in a slick, polished way, with perfectly coiffed hair and a smile that was too wide, too oily. His eyes, however, were sharp and calculating, missing nothing. They lingered on Anna for a moment too long, a slow, appreciative sweep that made her skin crawl. "Enzo," the man said, his voice smooth as silk. "A pleasure. I see you have a new companion. She's quite lovely." Enzo, who had been studying the wine list, slowly lifted his head. His eyes, when they met the other man's, were flat and cold as a winter lake. His hand, which had been resting on the table, moved to cover Anna's, his thumb stroking her knuckles, in a gesture that was both a comfort and a clear, unmistakable claim. His voice, when he spoke, dropped to a dangerous, quiet growl that was meant to be overheard. "She is with me. Remember that, Marco." The air crackled with unspoken violence. Marco's oily smile tightened at the edges, but he held Enzo's gaze for a beat longer before giving a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Of course, Enzo. My apologies." He backed away from the table, melting back into the crowd, but Anna could feel his eyes on her for the rest of the evening. The encounter was terrifying, a glimpse into the brutal, possessive rules of Enzo's world. Yet, as Marco's predatory gaze had made her feel like a piece of meat on display, she had also felt a confusing, dark flicker of security under Enzo's possessive touch. He was a monster, a violent, dangerous man who had stolen her life. But in that moment, he had been her monster, and he had shielded her from another. Internally, Enzo was incandescent with a cold, controlled fury at Marco's audacity, at the blatant disrespect. But mixed with that fury was another, more primal emotion, a surge of possessive pride in having this beautiful, intriguing woman at his side, in showing the world that she belonged to him. The evening was a lesson for both of them. Anna was learning the terrifying reality of the power Enzo wielded, and Enzo was learning that his feelings for his captive went far beyond simple ownership. They were tangled with a fierce, protective instinct he was only just beginning to understand. A few days after the tense dinner, Enzo made a surprising gesture, an offering that felt like a direct response to the fragile connection they had forged in his study. He knew her love for books, had seen the way her face lit up in his small private library. He was offering an olive branch, a glimpse into a different part of his world. He took her to an unassuming building in the West Village, a historic brownstone with no signage, a place you would walk past 1,000 times without a second glance. It was, he explained, a legitimate business front for his organization, a holding company for real estate investments. But its true purpose was hidden inside. He led her through a sterile modern office space and to a heavy unmarked wooden door at the back. He unlocked it, and the scent that wafted out was a balm to Anna's soul. The rich, intoxicating perfume of aging paper, leather, and wood polish. The room was a stunning, forgotten gem, a magnificent, old-world private library that seemed to exist out of time. 2 stories of floor-to-ceiling bookshelves soared upwards, connected by a wrought-iron spiral staircase. A large, mullioned window at the far end of the room cast dusty shafts of afternoon light onto worn leather armchairs and tables piled high with books. For the first time since the day she had taken the wrong suitcase, Anna's face lit up with a genuine, unadulterated joy. A soft gasp escaped her lips. She moved into the room as if entering a sacred space, her fingers reverently tracing the spines of first editions and leather-bound classics. This was her language, her sanctuary. Here, surrounded by the silent, waiting stories, she felt a piece of her old self return, a piece she thought had been lost forever. Enzo stood in the doorway, watching her, his usual hard expression softened by an emotion she couldn't quite decipher. He saw the transformation, the way the tension fell from her shoulders, the way her eyes shone with a light he had never seen before. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Her voice filled with awe. She turned to him, her face glowing. "Why do you keep it hidden away like this?" He leaned against the door frame, his hands in his pockets, a gesture that was uncharacteristically casual for him. "My father built it," he said, his voice quieter than usual. He was a scholar before he was, what he had to be. He believed that stories were the only things that truly lasted. The admission was a small, humanizing detail, a crack in the facade of the ruthless Mafia boss, revealing a layer of complexity she had never suspected. It added a hint of a legacy that wasn't solely built on violence and fear. It didn't excuse his actions. It didn't erase the prison of her life, but it complicated the monster she thought she knew. She began to wonder about the man buried beneath the cold, hard exterior, the man who was the son of a scholar. "I don't have the time for stories anymore," he added, a note of something that sounded almost like regret in his voice. For Enzo, seeing her unadulterated happiness in this space, a space connected to a part of his past he kept locked away, gave him a feeling of profound, unexpected satisfaction. It was a new sensation for him, providing for her in a way that wasn't just material, that wasn't about demonstrating his wealth or power. It was about giving her something that touched her soul. He found himself wanting to see her smile like that again, to be the one who could bring that light back into her eyes. He had brought her here as a strategic offering, a way to soothe his captive. But as he watched her move through the aisles, completely lost in her element, he realized it was more than that. He was sharing a piece of himself, a piece he shared with no one, and the act felt more significant, more intimate than any of the expensive gifts he had showered upon her. In this quiet, dusty library, surrounded by the ghosts of his father's books, the dynamic between them shifted once more, from captor and captive to something far more complicated and dangerously close to genuine connection. The penthouse was silent, shrouded in the profound darkness that comes only in the dead of night, high above the sleeping city. Anna woke with a blood-curdling scream, the sound torn from her throat by a terror so visceral it felt real. She was tangled in her silk sheets, her body trembling violently, her heart a wild, frantic drum against her ribs. The nightmare had been vivid, a chaotic collage of her deepest fears. She was back in her apartment, the horrifying contents of the suitcase splayed open on her floor. Enzo's cold, dark eyes were boring into her, his voice a low rumble as he pronounced her sentence. She saw her old life, her books, her parents, her quiet, safe world, all fading into a gray, distant memory as he dragged her away. The dream was a potent cocktail of everything she had lost and everything she now feared. Before the echoes of her scream had even faded, her bedroom door burst open with such force that it slammed against the wall. Enzo stood in the doorway, a black silhouette against the dim light of the hallway. He held a gun in his hand, his body coiled and ready for a fight, his eyes sweeping the room for an intruder, for a threat. He was the predator, the killer, every inch the dangerous man who had taken her. He stopped dead when he saw her. She was alone, sitting bolt upright in the massive bed, her face pale and streaked with tears, her body shaking with uncontrollable tremors. His entire posture changed in an instant. The killer vanished, the weapon lowered. The hard, violent tension drained out of him, replaced by something else, something softer and wholly unexpected. With slow, deliberate movements, he walked to the nightstand and carefully placed the gun on its polished surface, the metallic click unnaturally loud in the silent room. He then sat on the edge of her bed, not too close, giving her space. He didn't touch her, but his solid, silent presence was a calming force in the dark, a steady anchor in the turbulent sea of her fear. He just sat there, watching her, waiting. The sobs came then, racking her body, the words torn from a place of deep, aching despair. "I can't do this," she wept, the words muffled by her hands. "I can't live like this. I want my life back." She was breaking, the quiet resilience she had clung to finally shattering under the relentless pressure of her gilded cage. Enzo remained silent for a long moment, letting her cry, letting the storm of her grief and terror wash over her. When he finally spoke, his voice was surprisingly gentle, a low, soothing murmur that cut through her sobs. "I am here," he said softly. "You are safe." The words were simple, almost absurd given that he was the source of her terror, the very reason she was not safe. But in that moment, in the dark, with the ghost of her nightmare still clinging to her, they were exactly what she needed to hear. His presence, which had once been the source of her deepest fear, was now, inexplicably, a source of comfort. The line between captor and protector, already blurred, now seemed to dissolve almost completely. He stayed with her until her ragged breathing evened out, and the violent trembling subsided into a faint shiver. In her moment of absolute vulnerability, he didn't see a prisoner or a liability. He saw a woman he had inadvertently broken, a gentle soul struggling to survive in the brutal world he had dragged her into. And for the first time, he felt a sharp, unfamiliar pang of something that might have been regret. Anna, in turn, felt a confusing wave of gratitude. This man, this monster, had come to her in the night not to harm her, but to comfort her. He had shown her a flicker of humanity, of gentleness, that she never would have believed possible. The dynamic between them shifted irrevocably in the quiet darkness of that room. Enzo realized his proposition, his cold, calculated solution to a security problem, had unleashed consequences he had never anticipated. He had not just acquired a possession, he had taken a life, and he now felt a powerful, undeniable, and deeply inconvenient urge to protect her, not just from his enemies, but from the very world he ruled, and perhaps even from himself. The conversation in the study was a low, dangerous hum, a counterpoint to the silent, glittering city outside the window. Enzo's second in command, a man named Luca, stood before his desk. Luca was in his late 50s, a hardened, pragmatic man with graying temples and eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. He had served Enzo's father before him, and his loyalty to the Vitale family was absolute, which was why he was taking the risk of speaking so plainly now. He saw things with a cold, strategic eye, and what he was seeing worried him. "Boss, the other families are talking," Luca began, his voice carefully neutral. He did not fidget or look away. He simply stated the facts as he saw them. "Marco is spreading rumors, poison. He's telling anyone who will listen that the girl is a distraction. They see her as a weakness, a sign that you're going soft." He paused, letting the ugly words hang in the air. "They think she has a hold on you." Enzo did not look up from the financial reports spread across his polished desk. He made a small notation in the margin of a page with a gold pen, his hand perfectly steady. The silence stretched, and a lesser man would have started to sweat, but Luca remained still, waiting. Finally, Enzo capped his pen and placed it precisely parallel to the edge of the desk. He leaned back in his leather chair, the faint creak of it the only sound in the room. "Let them talk," he said, his voice a low, chillingly calm rumble. His gaze finally lifted from the papers and met Luca's. "Anna is my concern, not theirs. She is a guest in my home." He let the lie sit there, a deliberate misdirection that they both understood. "You will treat her with the respect due to me. She is off limits to everyone. Is that understood?" The question was a command, cold and absolute. Luca gave a short, sharp nod. "Yes, boss, of course." He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then pressed on, his loyalty overriding his instinct for self-preservation. "But a perceived weakness is a weakness. whether it's real or not, and it will be exploited. Marco isn't just spreading rumors. He's testing you. He's looking for an opening. Enzo's expression did not change, but a dangerous light flickered in the depths of his dark eyes. His possessiveness, which had begun as a strange, personal intrigue, was now a matter of defending his authority, his very name. He was aware of the danger, more aware than Luca could possibly know. But he would not bend. He would not hide her away or get rid of her to appease the whispers of his rivals. The thought was intolerable. She was his, and the world would learn to accept it, or the world would burn. "I'm aware of what Marco is doing," Enzo said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a silken thread. "Let him test me. He will find I am not as soft as he hopes." Feeling a sliver of agency for the first time since her world had been turned upside down, Anna began to push back against the sterile, impersonal environment of the penthouse. It was a quiet rebellion, a desperate attempt to reclaim a piece of herself in a place that was designed to erase her. It started small. She found the cold, angular furniture in the main living area oppressive, arranged for aesthetics rather than comfort. One afternoon, summoning a burst of defiant energy, she began to move it. She dragged a plush armchair and a side table from a far corner to a spot near the windows, creating a cozy reading nook where the morning sun streamed in. She angled a sofa to face the fireplace instead of a blank wall, making the vast space feel slightly more intimate. It was hard, physical work, and she was sweating and breathless by the time she was done, but a fierce satisfaction bloomed in her chest. She had made a mark, however small. Her rebellion then ventured into the kitchen. It was a state-of-the-art marvel of stainless steel and black granite, with appliances that looked like they belonged in a professional restaurant. It was also completely sterile, showing no signs of ever having been used for more than brewing a cup of coffee. Anna, who had always found a simple, grounding pleasure in cooking, decided to change that. She navigated the complicated touchscreen interfaces of the refrigerator and pantry systems, discovering they were stocked with the finest ingredients imaginable, from fresh vegetables and herbs to imported cheeses and prime cuts of meat. She started to cook. The silent, scentless apartment, which always smelled faintly of cleaning products and Enzo's expensive cologne, was soon filled with the warm, comforting aromas of her old life. The sharp, delicious scent of garlic and onions sizzling in olive oil, the fragrant perfume of fresh basil and oregano, the rich, yeasty smell of baking bread. She started insisting, with a quiet stubbornness, that Enzo found both infuriating and intriguing, that they eat their meals together at the casual kitchen island instead of at opposite ends of the ridiculously long, formal dining table. The first time he came home to the scent of roasting chicken and found her humming softly to herself in his kitchen, a smudge of flour on her cheek, his initial reaction was a flash of sharp annoyance. This was a disruption of his ordered world, a violation of the sterile peace he had cultivated. But as he stood there, watching her move with a natural, easy grace through his kitchen, he found the annoyance fading, replaced by something else, something he couldn't quite name. The apartment felt different. It felt warmer, more alive. It felt, for the first time, something vaguely like a home. He found himself surrendering to her small acts of domestic rebellion. He ate the simple, delicious meals she prepared, sitting on a stool at the kitchen island. The space between them now measured in feet instead of yards. It was a subtle surrender of control on his part, a silent acquiescence. He was letting her change his space, and in doing so, he was letting her change him. The walk was a rare concession, a calculated risk Enzo had finally agreed to after days of Anna's quiet, persistent request. She felt like she was suffocating, that the walls of the penthouse were slowly closing in on her. She needed to feel the sun on her face, to breathe air that hadn't been filtered through a building's ventilation system. The permission came with conditions, of course. She was escorted by Luca and another guard, a mountain of a man named Dmitri, whose face was a roadmap of old scars. They chose a quiet, tree-lined street near a small park, a place with few people and clear sightlines. For a few precious moments, Anna felt almost normal. The late afternoon sun was warm on her skin. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves in the trees overhead, and the simple act of walking on a public sidewalk felt like an incredible freedom. She carried a hard metal water bottle in her hand, its cool weight a small, solid comfort. The normality was shattered in an instant. A black van, which had been parked halfway down the block, suddenly roared to life, its tires screeching as it swerved to a halt directly in their path, blocking the sidewalk. The side door slid open with a violent bang, and two men in the dark tracksuits and ski masks jumped out. This wasn't a hit, it was an abduction attempt. A clear and brutal message to Enzo, sent via the woman he claimed as his. Luca reacted instantly, his movements swift and economical. "Dimitri, get her back," he yelled, shoving Anna behind him as he drew a handgun from beneath his jacket. The other guard moved to cover them, but the attackers were fast and aggressive. One of them engaged Dimitri, a blur of violent motion and grunts of effort. The other, armed with a collapsible baton, broke past the guard and lunged directly for Anna. Terror, pure and absolute, seized her, freezing her for a split second. The man's masked face filled her vision, his eyes cold and merciless behind the holes in the fabric. He reached for her, his gloved hand like a claw. In that instant, something primal and ferocious ignited inside her. The terror was still there, but it was eclipsed by a white-hot surge of pure adrenaline, a fierce, desperate will to survive. Acting on pure, unthinking instinct, she swung the hard metal water bottle in her hand with all her might. She wasn't aiming, she was just lashing out, a cornered animal fighting back. The bottle connected with the side of the man's head with a sickening metallic thud. He grunted, stumbling back, his eyes wide with surprise behind the mask. He was stunned for only a crucial second, but it was the only opening Luca needed. He pivoted, his movements a blur, and neutralized the attacker with a swift, brutal efficiency that made Anna's stomach turn. The fight was over in less than 30 seconds. The two attackers were incapacitated on the ground, and the black van sped away, its tires squealing in retreat. The street was suddenly quiet again. The only sounds the harsh, ragged breathing of the men and the frantic pounding of Anna's own heart. Luca, his face grim, looked from the downed man to Anna. She was trembling, her knuckles white, where she still gripped the dented water bottle. He looked at her wide, terrified eyes, and then at the man she had struck. A new, grudging respect flickered in his gaze. He had viewed her as a fragile liability, a delicate problem. He had been wrong. Back in the penthouse, the atmosphere was electric, charged with a tension so thick it was almost hard to breathe. When Enzo learned of the attack, he became incandescent with a cold, controlled rage that was far more terrifying than any shouting or overt violence. He paced the length of the vast living room, his movements like those of a caged panther, sleek, silent, and filled with a deadly, coiled energy. His anger was not directed at Anna. It was directed at Marco for his audacity, and at himself for failing to protect her, for allowing her to be exposed to the brutal reality of his world. The mask of calm, detached control he usually wore was completely gone, stripped away to reveal the raw, lethal predator that lay just beneath the surface. He had been in his study when Luca had called him with the news. He had listened in dead silence, and when he emerged, his face was a mask of stone, but his eyes were blazing with a black, murderous fire. His first words were to her. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his gaze sweeping over her, scanning her for any sign of injury, any bruise, any scratch. "Did they hurt you?" he asked, his voice tight with a fury that was barely concealing a raw, jagged fear. "Anna, are you all right?" She was shaken, her body still humming with the residual adrenaline of the attack, but she was resolute. She met his blazing eyes, her own voice stronger than she expected it to be. "I'm fine. I'm not hurt." She took a breath, the words she knew she had to say tasting like ash in her mouth. "Enzo, this is because of me. The rumors, this attack, it's all because I'm here. You should just let me go. It would be safer for you." He stopped pacing and turned to her, his entire body radiating a furious energy. He closed the distance between them, his hands coming up to cup her face, his grip firm but not painful, forcing her to meet his gaze. The fire in his eyes was overwhelming. "Let you go," he repeated, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Never." The word was a vow, a promise sealed with all the violence and power he possessed. "You are mine, Anna. Do you understand me? Mine, and I protect what is mine." His thumbs stroked her cheeks, a gesture of impossible tenderness amidst his terrifying fury. "Marco is a dead man for touching you. He is a dead man for even thinking of touching you. He will learn that. They will all learn that." This was no longer about a debt. It was no longer about managing a security breach. This was a raw, primal declaration of devotion, forged in violence and fear. His possessiveness had fully transformed. He wanted her, and he was willing to go to war to keep her. The raw, violent emotion pouring off him was overwhelming for Anna. The fear was still there, a constant, humming presence beneath the surface of her skin. But it was now inextricably tangled with a powerful, undeniable, and deeply terrifying attraction to this dangerous man who had just declared war on her behalf. He was a monster, but he was her monster, and he had just promised to burn the world down to keep her safe. The following morning, the penthouse had transformed. The serene, minimalist space had become a war room. Enzo's study, once a place of quiet order, was now the epicenter of his impending storm. Maps of the city were spread across his massive desk, marked with red ink. Notes and diagrams were taped to the glass walls, detailing logistics and personnel. Enzo stood in the center of it all, a figure of cold, focused, and deadly intent. He was on the phone, his voice a low, lethal command, issuing orders that would set the city's underworld on fire. He was no longer the conflicted captor. He was the Vitale boss, a king preparing to defend his territory and, more importantly, his queen. Anna entered the study, her footsteps silent on the marble floor. She was pale, the events of the previous day having left their mark, but her eyes were clear and determined. She had spent the night wrestling with her fear, with the terrifying reality of what Enzo was about to do in her name. He ended his call without looking at her, his focus entirely on the plans before him. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady in the tense silence of the room. "I'm going to remove a threat," he replied, his voice devoid of all emotion, his eyes still fixed on a map. He tapped a location with his finger. "This is my world, Anna. This is what I do to protect what is mine." A wave of cold dread washed over her. This was real. Men would get hurt, or worse, because of her. "Don't," she pleaded, taking a step closer. "Don't start a war because of me." He finally looked at her then, and for a fleeting moment, the cold mask of the Mafia boss cracked, revealing a profound weariness in his eyes. "It's too late for that," he said, his voice softer now, laced with a deep, aching regret. "The war started the moment he put his hands on you." He paused, his gaze holding hers, a silent, agonizing conversation passing between them. "But there is still a choice. For you." He turned from the maps and walked to a heavy, ornate wooden chest in the corner of the room. He opened it and removed a simple, unmarked manila folder. He walked back to the desk and placed it before her. A stark, plain object in a room buzzing with violent intent. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, the contents screamed of a life she couldn't imagine. There was a passport, a Canadian one, with her photograph but a name she didn't recognize. There was a first-class plane ticket, open-ended, to anywhere in the world. And there were documents for a Swiss bank account, detailing a balance of $1 million. "You can leave," Enzo said, his voice a low, rough whisper. The words seemed to cost him everything. "I will have my people ensure your safety. They will get you out of the country, set you up in a new life. You will never have to see me or this world again. You can be free." He took a deep, shuddering breath, the effort it took to offer her this escape physically painful to watch. "Or you can stay." He looked at her, his dark eyes raw with a vulnerability she had never seen before. "But if you stay, there is no more in between. No more prisoner, no more guest. You stay as my partner, my equal." He swallowed hard, the final word catching in his throat. "My wife, the choice is finally, truly yours." The power, which he had held so completely since the moment he'd walked into her apartment, had now shifted entirely into her hands. He was offering her true freedom, a life of safety and peace far away from him, even though the thought of it was clearly tearing him apart. Anna stood alone in the vast living room, the folder lying on the sleek glass coffee table like a bomb, a stark symbol of her two possible futures. The silence of the penthouse was absolute, a blank canvas upon which her thoughts painted a chaotic, clashing mural. She looked out the window at the sprawling city, a world she had once called home, a world she could now return to, or leave behind forever. Her mind drifted back to her old life, to its quiet safety and gentle predictability. Her apartment in Queens, the scent of old books, the familiar faces at the library, the comforting rhythm of her days. It all felt like a black and white photograph from a lifetime ago. It was safe, yes, but it was also muted, gray. She had been content, but had she been truly alive? Her life with Enzo was a chaotic, terrifying, violent masterpiece of color and sensation. In the past few weeks, she had felt more alive, more afraid, and more profoundly herself than she ever had before. She thought of his unexpected gentleness after her nightmare, the way his solid presence had been a comfort in the dark. She remembered the way his eyes had softened when he saw her in the library, a flicker of a shared soul in a place of stories. She felt the phantom heat of his hands on her face, heard the raw, fierce protectiveness in his voice as he declared her his, as he promised to go to war for her. She realized, with a certainty that was both terrifying and liberating, that the tangled knot of fear, gratitude, and fascination she felt for him had unraveled into something far simpler and infinitely more complex. She was in love with this impossible, dangerous man. From the corner of her eye, she saw him. Enzo was standing silently in the doorway of the study, his face a mask of unbearable tension, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was watching her, bracing himself for her to pick up that folder and walk out of his life forever. He had given her the choice, and now he was enduring the agony of waiting for her to make it, with deliberate, steady hands that betrayed none of the storm raging inside her. Anna picked up the passport and the plane ticket from the folder. She held them for a moment, the crisp paper a tangible representation of her escape. Enzo's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek. This was it. He was losing her. She walked not to the door, but to the sleek modern fireplace set into the wall. With a flick of a switch, a line of clean, blue and orange gas flames danced to life. Enzo watched, his expression a mixture of confusion and dawning hope. Anna held the documents over the flames, and without a moment's hesitation, she let them go. They curled instantly, the edges blackening before the fire consumed them, turning her escape route, her old life, her freedom, into nothing but floating gray ash. The sight of the documents burning, of his offer being turned to cinders, finally cracked Enzo's stoic facade. A wave of profound, soul-shaking relief washed over his features, so powerful it seemed to physically stagger him. He had been prepared to lose her, had forced himself to be strong enough to let her go, but he had not, in his wildest dreams, been prepared for her to choose him. Anna turned from the fire to face him, her eyes clear and unwavering. her voice ringing with a newfound strength in the silent room. "My place is here," she said, her heart soaring with a terrifying, beautiful certainty. "With you." He crossed the room in 3 long, predatory strides, the distance between them vanishing in a heartbeat. He pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his hard chest, as if he could absorb her into himself, as if to reassure himself that she was real, that she was truly there, that she had chosen to stay. He tangled one hand in her hair, tilting her head back, and his mouth came down on hers. The kiss was nothing like their previous tense, uncertain encounters. This was not a kiss of possession or control, of a captor claiming his prize. This was a kiss of raw, desperate gratitude, of a deep, unrestrained love he had thought himself incapable of feeling. It was the kiss of a drowning man finding air, of a king finding his queen. It was a promise, a vow, a seal on the choice she had just made, binding their 2 disparate souls together in the heart of the flames. He finally broke the kiss, resting his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged, his eyes closed as if savoring the moment. His voice, when he spoke, was thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before, a raw, unguarded love that stripped away the last of her fears. "Then you are my queen," he murmured, his lips brushing against hers with each word. "And God help anyone who ever tries to harm the queen." It was a mutual surrender. Anna was surrendering to her love for this dangerous man, embracing the violent, uncertain life that came with him. And Enzo, in that moment, was surrendering his heart. A part of himself he thought was long dead and buried, to her care. The debt was forgotten, erased, replaced by a bond of love and partnership that was more binding than any threat or promise he had ever made. They had chosen each other against all logic, against all reason, and in the heart of the lion's den, they had found their home. Weeks later, Anna stood on the penthouse balcony, the cool night air a gentle caress against her skin. The city glittered below them, a breathtaking carpet of fallen stars that stretched to the horizon. The view was the same, but she was different. She was no longer a prisoner looking out at a world she couldn't touch. She was the mistress of the castle, surveying her kingdom. She wore a beautiful evening dress of sapphire blue silk, but it was one she had chosen herself. From a shopping trip where Enzo had watched her with a quiet, contented smile, his presence a comforting warmth at her side rather than a guard's shadow. The silent, undeclared war with Marco was over. It had been swift, brutal, and decisive. Enzo had moved with a terrifying efficiency, and the whispers in the underworld had fallen silent. The message had been sent and received. The queen was not to be touched. Enzo came up behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his familiar scent of expensive cologne and something that was just uniquely him enveloping her. They stood in comfortable silence, a portrait of intimacy and power, 2 people from impossibly different worlds who had found their center in each other. Anna knew their life would never be simple. It would never be truly safe. There would always be shadows at the edges, new threats on the horizon. The world Enzo inhabited was built on a foundation of violence and fragile alliances, but for the first time in her life, she felt a profound and unshakable sense of belonging. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. She hadn't just taken the wrong suitcase. She had stumbled into the right life, a life she had been strong enough to claim, to fight for, and to choose. Enzo's voice was a soft murmur against her hair, a gentle vibration that resonated deep within her. "Are you happy, my Anna?" She leaned back into his strength, into his embrace, a genuine, radiant smile spreading across her face as she looked out at the endless, glittering city lights. The fear was gone, replaced by a deep, abiding love and a quiet, fierce strength she never knew she possessed. She was no longer the timid librarian from Queens. She was Anna Vitale, and she was finally home. "I'm home," she whispered. The words a perfect, simple truth. The debt had been repaid, not with service or money, but with love, a currency far more valuable and binding than anything that had ever been in the suitcase. It was a dark fairy tale that had found its unconventional happily ever after, not in a castle in the clouds, but in a gilded cage in the sky, a cage they had transformed together into a kingdom.